The Carolina backcountry in 1780 was not a place for children. It was the heart of a savage and brutal theater of the American Revolution, a landscape torn by ambushes, massacres, and unforgiving skirmishes where the lines between soldier and civilian blurred into the blood-soaked soil. In this crucible, a boy of 13 was being forged. His name was Andrew Jackson. Born in the Waxhaws region, a rugged settlement of Scotch-Irish immigrants straddling the border of North and South Carolina, Jackson's life was already marked by loss. His father had passed away just before his birth. Raised by his mother, Elizabeth, a woman he described as gentle as a dove and as brave as a lioness, Andrew and his two older brothers were steeped in the cause of independence. The war arrived at their doorstep with a ferocity that shocked even the hardened settlers. In May 1780, at the Battle of Waxhaws, British Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton's forces ruthlessly cut down nearly 300 surrendering American soldiers in what became known as the Waxhaw Massacre. The outrage from this act of barbarity rippled through the community. Fueled by the stories of the slaughter and encouraged by their patriotic mother, 13-year-old Andrew and his older brother Robert joined the local militia. Too young for the regular ranks, they served as scouts and messengers, darting through the dangerous territory on vital errands for the Continental Army. Their eldest brother, Hugh, had already been lost to the war, succumbing to heat exhaustion after the Battle of Stono Ferry a year earlier. For the young Jacksons, the fight was not an abstract political ideal. It was a deeply personal struggle for survival and vengeance. In April 1781, that struggle became terrifyingly immediate. Acting on a tip from a Tory neighbor, British dragoons raided the home where Andrew and Robert were staying, capturing them both. They were now prisoners of war, boys at the mercy of an army they had been raised to despise. It was here, in a moment of stark confrontation, that the unbendable core of Andrew Jackson's character was revealed to the world. A British officer, seeking to humiliate his young captive, pointed to his mud-caked boots and issued a curt command: "Clean them." The boy, barely 14, stood defiant. His response would echo through the rest of his life, a declaration of his own intrinsic worth and a refusal to bow to any authority he deemed illegitimate. "Sir," Jackson stated, his voice steady, "I am a prisoner of war, and claim to be treated as such." The officer, enraged by this insolence from a backwoods colonial, raised his sword and swung it violently at the boy's head. Jackson instinctively threw up his left arm to parry the blow. The blade was sharp. It sliced his hand to the bone and gashed his forehead, leaving him with deep, permanent scars. These physical marks were more than just wounds. They became a visible testament to his defiance, a lifelong reminder of the price of standing one's ground against tyranny. His brother Robert, who also refused the officer's command, was struck a heavy blow to the head. The ordeal had just begun. The brothers were forced to march 40 miles to a British prison camp in Camden, South Carolina. There, they were thrown in with other ill and malnourished prisoners receiving no medical treatment for their wounds. The conditions were horrific, and both boys soon contracted smallpox. Their mother, Elizabeth, upon hearing of their capture, undertook a desperate journey to Camden and managed to negotiate their inclusion in a prisoner exchange. Her victory was bittersweet. The 40-mile journey home was an agony. Robert was so ill he had to be placed on the only horse they had, while Andrew, burning with fever, walked barefoot and without a jacket, exposed to the elements. 2 days after reaching home, Robert died. Andrew was delirious and near death himself, but over several agonizing months he slowly recovered. The war, however, was not finished with its decimation of the Jackson family. Once Andrew was out of danger, Elizabeth journeyed to Charleston to nurse other American prisoners of war held on British ships. There, she contracted cholera and died. At the age of 14, Andrew Jackson was an orphan. The Revolution had taken everything from him: his home, his health, and his entire immediate family. He emerged from the conflict burdened with a profound sorrow and a deep-seated hostility toward Great Britain. a nation he would forever blame for the annihilation of his world. The boy who survived carried not only the scars on his head and hand, but the deeper, invisible wounds of a nation born in violent struggle. He once famously said of himself, "I was born for a storm, and a calm does not suit me." The storm of the Revolution had made him. The boy, forged in the fires of the Revolution, would carry that storm with him as he headed west, seeking a new life on the Tennessee frontier. After the Revolution, the orphaned Andrew Jackson moved to North Carolina to study law, and by 1788 he had ventured west to the frontier town of Nashville, Tennessee. In this rugged, often lawless environment, Jackson thrived, building a successful legal practice, acquiring land, and establishing himself as a prominent figure. His ambition and forceful personality quickly propelled him into a position of leadership. In 1802, in a contentious election against the state's revolutionary hero and governor, John Sevier, Jackson was elected Major General of the Tennessee Militia. It was a role that seemed destined for a man who had been a soldier before he was truly a man. He would not have to wait long for a war to command. The War of 1812 provided the stage, but Jackson's first major test came not against the British directly, but against their allies, a faction of the Creek Nation known as the Red Sticks. The Creek War was a brutal conflict, a civil war among the Creek people that became enmeshed in the larger international struggle. For Jackson, the Red Sticks alliance with the British was all the justification he needed. The old animosities, born in a prison camp decades earlier, surged to the surface. He called for a spirit of revenge against the Red Sticks, whom he held responsible for attacks on frontier settlements. He drove his volunteer army with relentless determination, earning the fear of his enemies, who called him Sharp Knife and Mad Dog Jackson. Yet, among his own men, a different legend was being born. During a particularly arduous march, with his soldiers sick and on the verge of mutiny, Jackson refused orders to disband. Instead, he pledged his own funds for supplies and gave up his own horses for the wounded, choosing to walk alongside his men through the wilderness. His troops, witnessing his unyielding resolve and willingness to share their hardship, remarked that their general was as tough as the strongest wood they knew. They began to call him Old Hickory, a nickname that perfectly captured his resilience and iron will. It was as Old Hickory that he led his forces to the decisive Battle of Horseshoe Bend on March 27, 1814. In a fierce engagement, Jackson's army, which included Cherokee allies and a young Sam Houston, crushed the Red Stick warriors, slaughtering more than 800 and effectively ending the Creek War. The victory was total, breaking the power of the Red Sticks and forcing the Creek Nation to cede 23 million acres of land to the United States. Jackson's reputation as a ruthless and effective military commander was now firmly established. His greatest triumph, however, was yet to come. Promoted to Major General in the U.S. Army, Jackson was tasked with defending the Gulf Coast. In late 1814, he learned that a massive British force was preparing to attack the vital port of New Orleans. He arrived in the city on December 1st and took absolute command of its defense. The army he assembled was a testament to his pragmatism and sheer force of personality. It was a motley coalition that defied convention. U.S. Army regulars stood alongside Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen, Louisiana militia, Choctaw warriors, and free African-American battalions. Most remarkably, Jackson accepted the help of the notorious privateer Jean Lafitte and his Baratarian pirates, a group he had previously condemned as hellish banditti. He united these disparate factions with a single, unbending purpose: to drive the British into the sea. On the morning of January 8, 1815, the British launched their main assault. A force of over 5,000 veteran redcoats, fresh from the Napoleonic Wars, advanced on Jackson's defensive line, a fortified earthwork of mud and cotton bales built along the Rodriguez Canal. The result was one of the most lopsided victories in American history. From behind their ramparts, Jackson's men unleashed a devastating volley of rifle and artillery fire. The British attack faltered, then collapsed into chaos. In just over 30 minutes, the battle was over. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, including the death of their commanding general, Sir Edward Pakenham. The American losses were stunningly light. By most counts, only 13 dead and a few dozen wounded. The Battle of New Orleans was a staggering victory that transformed Andrew Jackson from a regional hero into a national icon, his fame second only to George Washington's. The battle, fought and won after the Treaty of Ghent had officially ended the war, became a powerful symbol of American democracy and frontier spirit triumphing over the old European order of aristocracy and empire. For the nation, it was a moment of profound pride. For Andrew Jackson, it was something more. It was the ultimate act of vindication. The orphan of the Revolution, scarred and left for dead by the British, had risen to inflict upon them their most humiliating defeat. The hero of New Orleans was now the most popular man in America, and his path inevitably turned from the battlefield to the turbulent world of national politics. Andrew Jackson's triumph at New Orleans catapulted him to a level of national fame that made a presidential candidacy almost inevitable. He was the embodiment of the American self-made man, a Westerner who had risen from obscurity to become the nation's greatest military hero since Washington. As the 1824 presidential election approached, the political landscape was in a state of flux. The Federalist Party had dissolved after the War of 1812, leaving the Democratic-Republican Party as the sole political entity in the nation. This era of good feelings was, however, deceptive. Without a rival party to unite against, the Democratic Republicans fractured internally, resulting in a crowded field of 4 formidable candidates, all vying for the presidency under the same party banner: Andrew Jackson, the people's hero; John Quincy Adams, the brilliant and experienced Secretary of State and son of the second president; Henry Clay, the charismatic Speaker of the House from Kentucky; and William H. Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury who had the backing of the party establishment. The election of 1824 marked a watershed moment in American politics. For the first time, the popular vote became a significant factor. In a wave of democratic reform, 18 of the 24 states had moved to allow voters, rather than state legislatures, to choose their presidential electors. This expansion of the franchise meant that a candidate's popularity with the common man mattered more than ever before. When the votes were tallied, the results were clear, yet inconclusive. Andrew Jackson was the undeniable favorite of the American people. He won a commanding plurality of the popular vote, securing over 151,000 votes to Adams' 114,000. He also led in the Electoral College with 99 votes. Adams was second with 84, followed by Crawford with 41 and Clay with 37. Jackson had won, but he had not won outright. The Constitution required a majority of the electoral votes to secure the presidency, and with the votes split 4 ways, Jackson fell short of the 131 needed. The nation faced a constitutional crisis not seen in decades. As dictated by the 12th Amendment, the decision was thrown to the House of Representatives, where each state delegation would cast a single vote to decide the election from among the top 3 candidates. This process immediately eliminated Henry Clay, the 4th-place finisher. Yet, in a supreme irony, Clay, the man who could no longer become president, was now in the position to decide who would be. As Speaker of the House, Clay wielded immense influence. He was the quintessential Washington insider, a master of political negotiation. He also harbored a deep personal and political animosity toward Andrew Jackson. Clay saw Jackson not as a statesman, but as a dangerous military chieftain, a man of volatile temper and autocratic tendencies who was unfit for the presidency. The choice for Clay was between Adams, a man whose political philosophy was closer to his own American system of internal improvements and protective tariffs, and Jackson, his Western rival whom he profoundly distrusted. The decision was not difficult. Clay met privately with Adams, and soon after, the Speaker began to marshal his considerable support behind the Secretary of State. On February 9, 1825, the House of Representatives convened for the contingent election. The backroom maneuvering paid off. On the very first ballot, John Quincy Adams won the support of 13 state delegations, a bare majority, and was declared the 6th President of the United States. Andrew Jackson, the man who had won the popular vote and the most electoral votes, had been defeated. The outrage from Jackson and his supporters was immediate and explosive. Just days after the election, President Adams announced his choice for Secretary of State, Henry Clay. At the time, the post was widely seen as the direct line of succession to the presidency. To the Jacksonians, this was the smoking gun, the proof of a cynical deal. They furiously denounced the outcome as a corrupt bargain, a sordid transaction in which the will of the people had been bartered away by two ambitious politicians in pursuit of their own self-interest. For Andrew Jackson, this was more than a political defeat. It was a profound injustice that resonated with the deepest wounds of his past. Once again, a powerful, seemingly illegitimate authority had conspired to deny him what he had rightfully earned. But the political establishment had fundamentally misjudged their man. The corrupt bargain did not crush Andrew Jackson. It ignited him. Almost immediately after the House vote, the Tennessee legislature renominated him for the presidency, launching what would effectively become a 4-year campaign for vindication. The charge of corruption became his rallying cry, a powerful narrative that pitted the common man against a decadent political elite. This single event galvanized his supporters, shattered the old Democratic-Republican Party, and led to the formation of a new political force built in his image, the Democratic Party. The bargain that made Adams president would, in the end, create the populist revolution that would sweep Jackson into the White House 4 years later. Jackson's 4-year campaign for vindication culminated in a resounding victory. But his greatest battle as president would be fought not against a political rival, but against a financial institution he viewed as a monster. The presidential election of 1828 was a rematch fueled by 4 years of simmering resentment. It was a brutal and deeply personal contest, one of the first to resemble a modern political campaign, characterized by mudslinging, rallies, and a direct appeal to the masses. Jackson's supporters portrayed him as the champion of the common man, while Adams was cast as an elitist aristocrat who had gained power through a corrupt bargain. The result was a landslide. Jackson won with 56% of the popular vote and a commanding 178 electoral votes to Adams' 83. It was a victory he interpreted as a clear and undeniable mandate from the American people to dismantle the structures of privilege and power he believed had corrupted the republic. His primary target was the most powerful financial entity in the country, the Second Bank of the United States. Headquartered on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia, the BUS was a private corporation operating under a federal charter. It served as the U.S. government's fiscal agent, holding federal deposits, facilitating transactions, and issuing paper currency. By regulating the credit issued by state banks, it exerted immense control over the nation's economy. To its supporters, it was a vital instrument of financial stability. To Andrew Jackson, it was a monster, a hydra of corruption. His opposition was visceral and deeply rooted. Personally, he harbored a profound distrust of all banks, paper money, and credit, a sentiment born from a disastrous land deal in his youth that left him with worthless paper notes. Philosophically, he saw the bank as a dangerous and unconstitutional monopoly that concentrated the nation's wealth and power in the hands of a small, unelected elite, far from the reach of public accountability. He believed it made rich men richer by act of Congress at the expense of the farmers, mechanics, and laborers who formed the backbone of the nation. At the helm of the bank was its president, Nicholas Biddle, a wealthy, well-educated Philadelphian who embodied everything Jackson distrusted about the Eastern establishment. The clash between the rugged frontier general in the White House and the urbane financier on Chestnut Street was inevitable, a struggle for the soul of the American economy. The conflict, which would become known as the Bank War, escalated in 1832. Although the bank's charter was not set to expire until 1836, Jackson's political opponents, led by Senators Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, saw an opportunity. They persuaded a reluctant Biddle to apply for an early recharter, calculating that they could force Jackson into a politically damaging decision ahead of the presidential election. A bill to recharter the bank passed both houses of Congress in the summer of 1832. Jackson's response was defiant. "The bank," he reportedly told his advisor Martin Van Buren, "is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." On July 10, 1832, he issued one of the most consequential vetoes in American history. His veto message was not a dry legal argument but a fiery populist manifesto. He attacked the bank as a bastion of exclusive privileges for the wealthy, a threat to states' rights and a danger to the liberties of the people. Clay and his allies had miscalculated badly. They made the bank the central issue of the 1832 election, and Jackson, framing the contest as a battle between the people and the aristocracy, won another resounding victory. Jackson viewed his re-election as an unequivocal mandate to destroy the bank once and for all. He would not wait for its charter to expire. In an unprecedented assertion of executive authority, he ordered the removal of all federal funds from the BUS, directing his Treasury Secretary to deposit the government's revenue into a selection of state-chartered banks, which quickly became known as pet banks. This move sparked a political firestorm. Biddle retaliated by contracting the bank's credit, deliberately inducing a financial panic to pressure the president. In Congress, Jackson's enraged opponents coalesced into a new political party, the Whigs, united by their opposition to what they saw as his tyrannical overreach. They circulated cartoons depicting him as a monarch, crowning him King Andrew I, a dictator trampling on the Constitution. The Senate, led by Henry Clay, took the extraordinary step of formally censuring the president for his actions. The political atmosphere in Washington grew toxic. The rhetoric became intensely personal and vitriolic, with Jackson's opponents in the Senate accusing him of corruption and incompetence, and the president returning the fire with his own heated threats. South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun, Jackson's former vice president turned bitter enemy, reportedly declared on the Senate floor that Jackson was a Caesar who ought to have a Brutus. This charged environment, where political opposition was framed in the language of tyranny and assassination, created a dangerous climate. It was a climate in which the line between political metaphor and physical threat could easily be blurred in the mind of a disturbed individual who believed a King Andrew stood in the way of his own royal destiny. The political war against King Andrew was about to spill out of the halls of Congress and onto the Capitol steps in a shocking act of violence. January 30th, 1835. Dawned cold and damp in Washington, D.C., a mist hanging in the air that seemed to amplify the winter chill. Inside the U.S. Capitol, a somber mood prevailed as the nation's leaders gathered for the funeral of South Carolina Congressman Warren R. Davis. Among the mourners was President Andrew Jackson. At 67, the president looked his age. Observers noted his gray hair and frail appearance as he leaned on a colleague for support, his hand resting on the heavy Hickory walking cane that had become his constant companion. But the fire that had defined his life still burned fiercely beneath the weathered exterior. Unseen in the crowd, another man waited. Richard Lawrence was an English-born house painter who had fallen on hard times. Once known as polite and industrious, his behavior had grown increasingly erratic over the preceding years. His mind had become consumed by a grand and tragic delusion. He believed he was the rightful King of England, Richard III, and that the United States government owed him a vast fortune for his royal estates. This fantasy became dangerously intertwined with the heated politics of the day. Lawrence fixated on President Jackson's war against the Second Bank of the United States, convincing himself that King Andrew, the very term used by Jackson's Whig opponents, was the sole obstacle preventing him from claiming his money and his crown. Earlier that day, sitting in his paint shop, Lawrence had been seen laughing to himself before abruptly standing and declaring, I'll be damned if I don't do it." He had armed himself with 2 single-shot Derringer pistols, identical and fully loaded. As the funeral service concluded, President Jackson and the procession of dignitaries began to exit through the Capitol Rotunda toward the east portico. Lawrence had positioned himself behind one of the massive pillars, waiting for his moment. As the president passed, Lawrence stepped out from his hiding place, closing the distance to less than 10 feet. He raised the first pistol, took aim at Jackson's heart, and pulled the trigger. A loud crack echoed across the portico as the gun's percussion cap exploded, filling the air with a puff of smoke. But there was no bullet. In a stunning failure, the gunpowder had not ignited. The pistol had misfired. For a moment, onlookers stood frozen in shock. But Jackson's reaction was instantaneous. All the frailty of his 67 years vanished, replaced by the ferocity of a soldier under fire. Rather than flinching or seeking cover, he lunged forward, charging directly at his assailant and raising his hickory cane high, ready to strike. Before he could reach him, Lawrence, equally determined, produced the second pistol, leveled it at the advancing president at near point-blank range, and fired again. Another loud crack, another puff of smoke, and another misfire. The spell of impossibility was broken. Chaos erupted on the portico. A Navy lieutenant tackled Lawrence, and a crowd of bystanders surged forward to help subdue the gunman. Among them was the legendary frontiersman and Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett, who helped wrestle the pistols away and restrain the attacker. But they could not restrain the president. Enraged, Jackson reached his attacker and began to savagely beat the downed man with his heavy cane, raining blows upon him until aides and congressmen physically pulled him away. Through the pandemonium, the president's voice roared, revealing the immediate conclusion his mind had drawn. "Let me alone! Let me alone!" he shouted. "I know where this came from." In his mind, this was no lone madman. This was a conspiracy, the inevitable violent culmination of the political war waged against him by his enemies. In the aftermath, as Lawrence was taken into custody, a sense of awe and disbelief settled over Washington. The 2 pistols were examined by experts. They were found to be properly loaded with good quality powder. When test fired, both weapons discharged perfectly, driving their bullets through inch-thick boards at 30 feet. The failure of 2 well-loaded pistols to fire in succession under such circumstances was a statistical anomaly of the highest order. An expert later calculated the probability of such a double misfire at 1 in 125,000. Many attributed the failure to the damp, humid weather. But for Jackson and his supporters, the explanation was far simpler. It was not a fluke of meteorology that had saved him. It was an act of divine providence. The miraculous survival on the Capitol steps was the most public display of Jackson's violent life. But to truly understand the man who charged his own assassin, one must look back to a bloodier, more calculated encounter on a dueling ground in Kentucky. The trial of Richard Lawrence was a brief and bizarre affair. Held on April 11, 1835, the prosecution was led by Francis Scott Key, the esteemed author of The Star-Spangled Banner. Lawrence's mental state was obvious to all. He entered the courtroom in flamboyant dress, interrupted the proceedings with wild rants, and informed the jury, "It is for me, gentlemen, to pass upon you, and not you upon me." After only 5 minutes of deliberation, the jury found him not guilty by reason of insanity. Lawrence would spend the remaining 26 years of his life confined to asylums, passing away in 1861. While the court had rendered its verdict, the political fallout continued. Jackson remained unshakably convinced that his political enemies, such as John C. Calhoun and Senator George Poindexter, were the true architects of the attempt on his life. Jackson's immediate assumption of a conspiracy and his own violent reaction to the attack were not the spontaneous actions of an aging man caught by surprise. They were the product of a personal code forged over a lifetime of conflict, a code most chillingly demonstrated 3 decades earlier on a dueling ground near Adairville, Kentucky. On May 30, 1806, Andrew Jackson faced Charles Dickinson, a young attorney and fellow plantation owner. The quarrel had festered for some time, stemming from a dispute over a horse racing bet and, more grievously, from public insults Dickinson had made against Jackson's wife, Rachel. Defending Rachel's honor was, for Jackson, a non-negotiable imperative. Dickinson was widely regarded as one of the best marksmen in America, a fact of which Jackson was keenly aware. Facing a superior shooter, Jackson devised a strategy of almost unimaginable fortitude and cold calculation. He decided to let Dickinson fire first. He would stand his ground, absorb the hit, and rely on his sheer willpower to remain standing long enough to take his own careful, deliberate, and lethal aim. "I should have hit him," Jackson later remarked, "if he had shot me through the brain." On that fateful morning, the two men stood at their marks. Dickinson fired first. A fleck of dust rose from Jackson's loose-fitting coat, and his left hand instinctively clutched his chest. Dickinson, horrified, recoiled and gasped, "Great God! Have I missed him?" But he had not missed. His bullet had shattered two of Jackson's ribs and lodged itself just millimeters from his heart. Jackson, however, did not fall. Fighting for self-command, his boot quietly filling with blood, he slowly raised his own pistol. Under the dueling code, Dickinson had to stand perfectly still and accept the return shot. Jackson took aim and squeezed the trigger. The pistol's hammer stopped at half-cock. In a controversial move that some deemed a violation of the rules, Jackson recocked the weapon, took aim again, and fired. The shot was true. Charles Dickinson was mortally wounded and died later that day. The bullet he fired would remain in Andrew Jackson's chest for the rest of his life, a constant, painful reminder of the encounter. This duel was not an isolated incident, but the most famous example of a life punctuated by violence. While claims that he fought in over 100 duels are likely exaggerations, he was involved in numerous altercations. In 1813, he engaged in a vicious tavern brawl with Senator Thomas Hart Benton and his brother Jesse, a fight that ended with Jackson taking a bullet in the arm. He was a man who met challenges not with negotiation, but with force, whether the weapon was a pistol, a dirk, a horsewhip, or a hickory cane. This lifetime of conflict provided the context for the events of 1835. The president who charged his own assassin was simply acting on the same brutal logic he had employed on the dueling ground. Absorb the attack, never show weakness, and utterly destroy the threat. Years later, as he prepared to leave the presidency in 1837, Andrew Jackson was asked if he had any regrets from his tumultuous time in office. His response was as stark and unyielding as the man himself. "Yes," he replied, "I regret I was unable to shoot Henry Clay or to hang John C. Calhoun,